What's up, legends? Welcome back to the Chase Immortal podcast. I'm Bonnie. Uncle Ben is at work, so I've taken over. But don't worry, I've got some exciting news for you. August is officially Western Australians Women in Spotlight Month here at Chase Immortal. Starting August 1st, we're kicking things off with the amazing Gemma MacDonald joining the podcast, and that's just the beginning. Over the next 4 weeks, we're bringing you some of WA's most influential women, including Claire Gabriel, Australian boxing champion and founder of Glove Up, and the first episode of Chase Immortal's own Shana Michelini's Hard Road YouTube documentary. WA women doing wonderful things for the community. You do not want to miss this lineup. Now, none of this happens without our amazing sponsors. Huge shout out to BH Engineering and Maniac Mafia for backing Women in Spotlight Month. Stay tuned for plenty more to come with these guys. And for today's episode, big thanks to BHM Resources and Coastline Mechanical for making it happen. Oh, and one more thing, official Chase Immortal podcast merch is now available at gloveup.com.au. Go grab yours. I've got mine. Now go watch the next episode of The Hustle with Daz. Bye!
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff.
Righto, what's going on, legends? We are back with the Chase Immortal podcast, back with Daz. We're in the home studio again. We got the new setup going on, got the neon lights up. She's all happening. How you going, Daz?
Good, my brother. I'm just loving that studio setup actually, and it's making my space look a bit blank. I need to get me some neon, I think.
Yeah, get some neon, mate. It's expensive, but it's good. And I've got the old Bronx. I've got the Bronx on the wall. They're not going the best, but we'll keep them up there. Giddy up. So what's going on? What's been happening, mate? Give us a bit of a recap.
Mate, so just come back from Japan with the little fam, so had a nice little break and keen to get stuck back into this. But today we're just, it's more of the veggies. We're going to get into the meat, I promise, but we need to, I was speaking offline a little bit about this. So the last couple of episodes been setting up a bit of a framework for the hustle in and around identifying the problem. So we got our little engineer's hats on, right? And we need to really understand the problem before we can jump into solution mode. And I know people are just keen to get into, based on some feedback and stuff like, just tell us what to do. Come on. But I really think it's worth our while spending a little bit of time identifying what is the problem. And it all boils down to, like, what we're going to talk about today is this question of what is money. So we've spoke the last couple of episodes about what we need to do, like, and what the problem is. And it does, like, revolve all around money and how it's starting to distort how we show up. And the last episode was about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Really understanding the psychology behind what it means to level up as a human, and it's different for everyone. If you haven't looked at that episode, go and have a look. Actually, I think it launches tomorrow as we're recording this one, so hopefully by the time this one comes out, people have had enough time to digest that one. Yeah, beautiful. So like episode 1 was about just getting your house in order, right? Grab a copy of The Barefoot Investor, go and put those fundamentals in place. If you're already a little bit more accelerated in your journey along that line, I still think it's worth revisiting The Barefoot Investor, go and reset. So it's all about increasing your cash flow, having a look at your situation, what's coming out of your bank account, where all the fees are eroding, where all your subscriptions are, and then some of the tools that you'll need to. What we're trying to essentially do, Benny, is build a fuck off money, right? Build up yourself resilience so that you can navigate whatever needs to happen. So a lot of people are living paycheck to paycheck. If that's you, that's cool. You know what I mean? Like it was probably some good feedback from last episode actually, was like, if you're on this journey, you are not alone. Like, it has taken, so many people are in this position, in this predicament where they can't, at the end of the week, they're rubbing two sticks together. Like, and like we've said before, we're not experts. We've just spent a bit of time looking at the problem, right? And trying to find the solutions, because we've realized that, it's kind of like this analogy, like two fish are swimming around in the water, right? One turns to the other, says, how's the water today? And the other one goes, what's water, right? It's the environment you're living in, you don't realize until you take a step back out of it and objectively look in to go, is that right? Is that the way life's supposed to be? So this is what the veggies are all about. It's just trying to really hone in on the problem, and the problem is money.
Yep. The problem is money. But the biggest thing from the first episode was a lot of people come back about optionality. People don't have it. They don't have it these days. It's hard to get, like everything's getting expensive. I was even talking to my mum the other day, and she's talking about something she had to go and buy, and she said, I bought this 6 months ago and it was $130, and today it's $160. I'm like, it's crazy. I said, everything's going up. It's ridiculous. But good feedback from the first episode. The takeaways are really good. The amount of people that said they went and got the Barefoot Investor, so good. And then episode 2, when this, by the time this does come out, it will be out. Everyone would have seen it. But there's some real good stuff about getting your life and your space in order. So we've really taken it along. And like you said, this isn't going to be a straight to where am I putting my money? What are we doing with money? Where's it all going? This is going to be the long road to setting yourself up. So if people do follow along and take the steps out of these episodes as you give them, I think they'll set themselves up good. And I've actually done it myself. I've gone and checked all my subscriptions, and I've got money bleeding out everywhere, like bad, hemorrhaging. And so I've got to dial that in real quick.
Yeah, and it's so easy to do, mate. And the more you earn, the more you spend, right? Because if you're not really onto, and if you've got no avenue or no vehicle in order to put that money to work, that's where stuff just starts leaking into your life, like the subscriptions and all that sort of stuff, right? So even like people on really good wages find themselves in this predicament where just slowly everything starts to erode in. And it comes down to, like last episode, we spoke a lot about this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but we also introduced this concept of time preference. So when your money doesn't work, it starts to distort how you see value. So the number one thing, and this is a good segue in today's episode actually, is the number one goal or the number one property that money should perform is a store of value. So this is the whole reason why we go to work, and the whole reason why we hustle, whole reason why we're swapping our time, blood, sweat, tears is for money, right? And that whole purpose of that is money should be a battery. It's like a battery for your energy, like it stores your energy. So I go to work and I put out this energy today, and it should be able to store that for me to go and use in the future. Now, when your money is not a very good steward of that goal as being a store of value, which I would argue, and we'll get into today, the reasons why our money today is not a good store of value, it then starts to distort how you express your value, how you communicate value to others is getting distorted. So then it actually starts to create a perverse kind of environment where you become a consumer. So you would way rather get a little buzz out of, if you've only got $10 to spare, you're going to go and buy the 6-pack, right? And you're going to go and get a little buzz rather than, because putting $10 away a week is not going to do anything for you. And that's the whole point of what we're going to explore through this series of episodes, is that when you can actually put that $10 to work, all of a sudden you've got a very good driver to make the $10, $15 into $20. And it starts to shift your behavior when you actually have vehicles in order to be able to create meaningful wealth for yourself with that end goal being optionality. This is where I've seen it like many, many, many times where behaviors start to shift and we start to move from this high time preference where I need the buzz today into a long time preference planning for the future when you actually can see a reward for your output, right? And that's where money is failing us. When we save money in a bank account, we can't see the benefit of it because we looked at chart after chart last episode of, why we're experiencing inflation. And it's basically due to this untethered printing of money. Like they can just print money out of thin air and it's starting to inflate prices. And then that's what's eroding our ability to put money in a bank and come back at a later date and spend it.
The biggest thing there is about the bank. Like when we're younger, right, you're told to put all your money into the bank. Save it in a bank, put it in a term deposit, put it in this. You're not getting anything from it. Like it's doing nothing. Like sitting in a bank in a savings account. Yeah, that's what I mean. This is pumped into you as a kid. So, and the problem with our generation is, like I'm 44, so when I was younger, this was all told you. This is set up your little Dolomite account, put all your money in there, keep saving in that. And as you get older, you think, oh yeah, your money sits in the bank and does that. It's doing nothing. Like absolutely nothing. It's sitting there making like $10 every 6 months. But then as you get older, the problem is you don't start getting your house in order till you get older, like people like myself. I didn't start thinking about money what I'm doing with my money till I was well into my 30s. We need to get this happening early for the people that are making money now when they're younger, when it's more expensive to live. Inflation's worse now. Everything costs more. Rent's more. Buying a house is more now. Like, you can't set yourself up like we did. We were sort of just on the cusp of that lucky. We sort of hit that lucky era where prices weren't too bad when we started buying houses. But people now, what are you meant to do?
Yeah, that's right, mate. And we'll explore the reason for that today in today's episode, where we got to today and why the money works the way it works. And that's essentially, you've hit the nail on the head, mate. Like, it's gotten progressively worse over time. And we'll show you where the change was. But like, historically, money, there's these two notions of money versus currency. So money is that store of value versus a currency, which is, I would argue, like our fiat currency today, is what we earn for the dollars that we earn today. Fiat means by decree. So it's a government issued by decree. You will use this money. You'll pay your tax in this money. You must earn in this money. And that has only been the case since 1971. So I'm sort of skipping ahead here, but we'll go back and we'll go through this journey. But historically, money has been the way that we've communicated value to each other as humans. So we'll go right back to the caveman days and take you on this journey in and around the different forms of money. And more importantly, look at the properties of money, or what makes a good money, and then have a look at what essentially happened here. Just 2 secs, Benny. I don't know if you can hear that, but my wife is blending something right now. So we might I think I can flag this to cut it out. No, that's all good. Yeah, cool. So we'll take that on that journey today in and around what the problem is now. So a lot of the advice that we're given in relation to money, like, was sound from grandma's days, right? So grandma, grandpa, a couple of generations back, they had to learn this hustle really importantly, because they've gone through wars, they've gone through like depressions, famines, even like borderline famines, even in the developed worlds. So those habits about keeping your expenditure low, they're all sound, but they had a money arguably that worked better than today. Today, our money loses purchasing power over time, and that's really been accelerated since 1971. And today we'll have a look at what that actually means.
And your money, like you said, loses value, but I think we touched on it in the first episode. If you've got a $50 note and you go and get a haircut with that $50 note, you give it to him, he gives you the change, that's still a $50 note. You know what I mean? But no one who's carrying cash around. No one's carrying cash. Everyone's paying with a card. Bang. That's a $2.50 transaction fee. Boos, for that haircut. Then he goes and uses that money to buy something else. $2.50 transaction fee. $2.50 every time you spend something off that $50. It costs you a fortune. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's just one of the trade-offs of like a digitized form of money, which, there's something to be said about value for value in terms of facilitating a transaction. I don't actually mind the idea of bank fees, to be honest. Like, shoot me down for saying that. But there's a reason for it. Like, if they're facilitating something, people should be paid for their time. But it doesn't distort the fact that as a $50 note, it's a bearer instrument. It maintains its value better, arguably, than a digital version of that. For that same reason, I hand that $50 over, it's going to spend like $50 on the other side without transactions eroding that. But I guess the underlying point of all of this is that we've spoken about the hurdle rate being inflation. That is why money doesn't work in a bank account, because arguably inflation rates can be higher than the interest that you're earning on having your money in that bank account. So last week we spoke about what is your true inflation rate, and I'll guarantee, just to recap on that, it's not CPI. It's not this index that the Reserve Bank states to us every quarter when they run the numbers. Here's the inflation rate for Australia. Everyone's different. Everyone's got different circumstances and different expenses, from, schooling to health to mortgages to whatever. So you can't put a blanket representation on that. And if you were to actually track your inflation rate personally, I'll guarantee you it's higher than the interest you're getting back on your bank. So if your inflation rate's higher than your interest rate, you're going backwards. And if your pay rise isn't going up by at least CPI or your inflation rate, again, you're going backwards. And that's arguably where people are really starting to feel, right? You go back to the 70s, you could survive off one wage. It wasn't easy, and they were very, meticulous about their spending and had really good habits, but it was possible. You can argue, fast forward to today, it's near impossible to run off one wage if you want to raise a young family. Like both mum and dad, there's not too many couples that you know that can sustain that lifestyle without significant trade-offs, like the FIFO guys as well. This is why FIFO is so popular, is that actually does give you a decent wage in order to be able to survive that. But like it comes at a massive trade-off. Blokes are spending so much time away from their family, like they're strangers to their kids, like that's probably loaded statement. But
with the FIFO money, he said you go up there and earn a good wage. It is ridiculous at the minute, the money up there, right? So we've got labourers on site where I am now. They're clearing $4,000 a week, right? That's just going around. This is the labourers that drive around and do all the on-the-ground stuff, setting up all the signs, cleaning up stuff, setting up all, like escorting vehicles in, escorting trucks in, just all the general shit. They're clearing $4,000 a week. Like some of them are 18 years old. 18 years old and they run around getting $4,000 a week at 18 years old. And like if they don't dial their money in, if they dial it in now, they could be set up for life by 30. If they don't, though, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's exactly right, mate. And like I said before, the more you earn, the more you spend, right? Because it then becomes disposable income. So that's part of the equation, right? Is if you are earning good money, is then what the hell do I do with it, right? And if you're not earning good money, it's like what are some of the options that can make that change for you? And it just means taking some action, eating your veggies, learning about the problem, and then when you don't have an avenue, like I just keep coming back to this point, when you don't have an avenue to put your money to work, that's going to give you significant return, and then you can see a benefit from doing it, then your habits won't change.
That's right. But like you said, the more you earn, the more you spend. That's everyone says it. Oh, I earn this much money, but I don't know what I do with it. What have I done? I don't know. Every time I come back to work, it's gone. Start again. Because you don't care. You're just tapping that card, boom, 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 boom. As soon as you get home for that week off, every week, oh yeah, new shoes, new hat, new this. Go out for lunch, take everyone out for lunch, dinner, boom, drinks. You're just tapping it, not even watching what's coming out.
And an extra $30 a month subscription, you don't think twice about it. But it's then, you look back and you go, holy shit, I've got $1,000 a month worth of subscriptions now. It's like, where the hell did they come from?
When you went back and said at the start there about the $10, if you save that a week, you're not really going to notice it. If you went and had a look at all your subscriptions and all that shit and dialed them in and then saved all that money instead of spending on them subscriptions you're not even using, like 100%. I've got apps on my phone. I've got an app on my phone that I remember downloading to do macros and shit ages ago, 2 years ago. That thing was still bleeding money out. I haven't used it for 18 months, I reckon. Like, I haven't touched it. It still had a subscription attached to it that I didn't even know was coming out. Like, it was wild.
The real diabolical thing with a lot of that, Benny, too, is they get you in early, $7.99 a month or something like this, right? But by the time you forget about it and come back, it's like $40 a month, and that's how they dial it in. Happened time and time again. I had an invoicing app that I use for my gigs, right? So I play music, that's my hustle, right? Part-time musician, 2 or 3 a month. Not enough to warrant having a big expensive invoicing package, but I got into an invoicing app years and years and years ago. And it was something ridiculous a year, $8 a year or something like this. Just reviewed it, $90 a year. I'm like, it's wild. It's just, and that happens every day of the week. So, those first couple of episodes, go back and have a listen. Increase cash flow, number one. Where are you bleeding money? Because what you need the cash flow in order to put it to work. So that was the whole idea around cleaning up house, as well as then there's just a recap on that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where the goal is to get off to get to a stage of fuck you money, where nothing matters. Like anything, and this is what the barefoot investor is really good at honing in, especially in the early stages, is get yourself to $2,000 in your bank account. People might think, shit, that's impossible. I can only save $10 a week, but you've got $2,000 worth of shit in your house that you can sell. Easy. Go around, sell it. Go and have a marketplace, Gumtree if it's still around, whatever. You can come up with $2,000. So if you've got $2,000 in your bank account, it straight away elevates you from the base layer of surviving on that Maslow's hierarchy into, well, now I can deal with most situations. right? And it doesn't sound like a lot. $2,000 in your bank account doesn't sound like a lot, but it can make, if you're in that stage of, holy shit, if I had a car breakdown tomorrow, it would ruin me. That's where you can't shift. You can't move up that hierarchy if that's your situation. So, and it's not to discourage or to disparage if you're in that situation. Everyone has been through that. Most people are in that situation. So, but there are options, right? So if you can get that bank account set up, that dedicated bank account where it's hard to touch, just get your $2,000 in there. And then that is your little safety net to say, well, if something bad happens tomorrow, I'm covered. And you just be disciplined in, I'm not touching that $2,000, right? So, these are the habits that start to build. And then what happens then from that point is you get yourself to a month worth of wages, 2 months worth of wages, 3 months worth of wages. That sounds like a lofty goal. Now, and you'll get to a point where we can understand investing, and then you can start to think about where you direct that time and energy. So for me, I've been to that stage. I'm lucky enough to understand this problem, understand the hustle, got myself to a point where I had 3 months worth of wages in my bank. Really, really lucky. Absolutely not discounting the fact that I was in a lucky position to be able to do that and identify it early and get myself there. But as you move forward, you can then go, well, maybe I don't need the actual 3 months, because you start to build yourself out some optionality in and around investing and putting that money to work in a better way, right? But if you've got 3 months worth of wages, pretty much you can get hit by a truck and you'll be okay. That's where you start to then, your mentality starts to shift in and around, well, now I have those options. Like, I have the worst case scenario covered. I've got my debt under control. I've got reasonable amount of productive debt. Credit cards are absolutely, get rid of them. That is if you've got a credit card, get rid of it. You do not need it in your life. Like, that should not be your emergency funds, like having that credit card. Because as soon as you've got that $3,000 limit on the credit card, I tell you what, 90% of people will max it out. And then they're continually servicing that debt.
On that, and we talked about it on the first episode, the way I run my setup, right? I've got my mortgage account, I've got my everyday account, and I've got a credit card all linked, right? I use the credit card for everything. Everything I do, I use a credit card. And then once a month, like the day before it's due, whatever's owing on it, I transfer out of my offset mortgage account into that credit card and pay it off. See, I've run that system for years.
It's not a bad strategy. It takes discipline. So I would argue it's not for everybody.
But see, that credit card isn't an emergency fund. That's not sitting there in case I need the money. Like, there's money sitting in my offset account, obviously. Like, my mortgage account is offset and everything that I earn goes into that. Then I leave a bit in the other account for shit that's coming out. And then I'll just use my credit card for everything. Everything I buy is on that credit card, using the bank's money, and then I pay it off once a month.
And there's some benefits, like with like points and stuff that you can exercise for frequent flyers and all that sort of stuff. So there's definitely benefits to it. But again, I would argue that is not for everybody. It can set a dangerous precedent if you're not disciplined and you don't understand it, and you don't have enough cash flow coming into your bank account to offset. And that's the number one problem here, I think, is that expenditure in today's society, it's way easy to get over levered. It is way easy to have too much going out than enough coming in. And that's all about that cash flow. So you got to have a reset. So if you're not disciplined with that, I haven't owned a credit card for 15 years because I've worn that scenario where I got myself in an over-levered position with a debt that wasn't productive, right? Debt is not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's productive, like a mortgage for your house. That's productive debt, like, arguably, right? Where we've spoken a little bit about some of the trade-offs with, and next episode we'll get right into, like, then what are your options? Like, when you've got that increased cash flow, you're doing the hustle, you've got, overtime coming in, or you've got a second side job or side hustle, and you started to increase those cash flow, you've assessed everything that's bleeding out. Now you're starting to tick the box, right? You're starting to get more money in your bank account that's coming out. That's the number one goal. Then what do you do with it, right? So again, credit cards have a purpose. When they're used productively, like you're using it productively, I would argue, that's great. But it can set a dangerous precedent to get you into a debt situation, which is nearly impossible to pay off. So if you've got that $3,000 limit and that car bill comes in, and you go and load up that $3,000 limit on that car bill, but you can only save the $10 a week, you're never paying that credit card off. It's there forever. So just a couple of things. Again, not financial advice. Check the caveat. Just two blokes having a yarn. But let's get stuck into the veggies today.
But that's a good before you do. So that's a good recap, right? So we're getting first episode. If you haven't watched it, go back and watch it. We're getting a house in order, right? Second episode, we're getting ourselves in order, getting set up to where you need to be. So this third episode, we're going to go back, and Daz is going to start now, and he's going to kick off about a bit of history of the money, where we come from, where the money's come from. So for everyone listening at home, this will be a journey through this stuff. So I've taken it on board. Everyone's going to take it on board. It's so good. Like the feedback from this episode is really good, and I like the way that you're presenting it. I like the way that we're structuring it, so we're not just rushing into all that stuff. But yeah, spot on. So rip into it, Daz.
Beautiful. Right. So I am going to share some screens today. I'll put some links to this stuff in the show notes for if you're listening, but we won't be using them as visual cues. So if you're listening at home on the pod in your commute in your car, it's fine. We'll talk all the way through it. But basically what we're introducing today is the functions of money, right? And then we're going to go back through. We're going to revisit these slides or these concepts quite a few times today, because we're going to take you on that journey of money and where we've gotten to this fiat currency situation. And it all ties back into the last couple of episodes. So the three main functions of money, right? Store of value. We've spoken about that already today. So when I go to work, my number one goal is to exchange my time and energy for money, right? So it's a battery that stores that energy for me to go and then direct it to how I see fit in the future. That's the number one goal for money. The other two main functions of money is medium of exchange. So that is, between it's the facility of extracting and exchanging the value. So if you do a service for me and I value that service, I'm going to give you the money, and it's one of these uniformly accepted like currencies, right? So it's facilitating that trade, and as well as a unit of account. So it also forms a bit of a backbone around how we put a dollar figure to, we're simple creatures, us humans, right? Like, how do I value something is I can put a number to it. I can quantify the unit of account. So it's then, if something costs me $100, I've got an inherent understanding of what that $100 means. So as a form of value, I can then compare that $100 worth of value to how much time it takes me to earn that $100, and that's how we start to understand, as a unit of account, as the base layer of putting a number to the figure, to the value, right? And then within each of these, there's properties of money. And we'll explore this today. So every time us as humans have gone through this evolution of money, because it has been an evolution, there's been different trade-offs. So we've introduced different forms of money over centuries as a means of communicating this value to each other. But each time we've introduced one, we've solved a problem, but arguably introduced other trade-offs. And there's always a trade-off. There is no one perfect form of money, but we're going to explore some of the options in and around what is the trade-offs, how do we understand those trade-offs, and what are the trade-offs we're happy to make in order to satisfy some of the others. And arguably, this is where it comes back to this slide here. This one says store of value, and there are three main properties that come to a store of value, and we're going to explore what these mean. So scarcity, right? If I have something that's readily available, if I can print money out of thin air, that's arguably not scarce. Right. If there's something that's too scarce, then it's not a good form of money either. So like platinum, right, is a very scarce metal. It's valuable, but it doesn't make a great money, right, because it's too scarce. So there's a balance between scarcity that creates a good form of money. The second thing is durable. So if I have a money that I can put in my pocket and I can reach into that pocket and pull it back out later on, it can go through the wash, all that sort of thing. That, again, is a good form of money. So coinage was arguably a good form of money in that regard versus, say, something like salt. So salt was used as a money, and it, was great as long as it didn't get wet. So as we go through history, we start to explore some of these trade-offs that were made. So immutable is another good one. Like immutable, it's a bit of a hard word to understand. It's got different meanings in different contexts, but essentially is like coinage, right? Great example of immutability. I hand it over, it's a bearer instrument. Once you've got that coin, I don't have a claim to it anymore. It's done, it's final. That transaction's final. But also, you know that it's got a face value, so it's worth something, right? So that's what immutability means. Then we move into medium of exchange. So within the medium of exchange, we've got two. Is it portable? Ease of transport. So salt, right, wasn't a great example in maths because I had to transport it. Gold is even not a great one for, when we come towards global trade today. To settle in gold is actually very cumbersome. A digital version of money is very portable, right? I just send it to you. But then we've got trade-offs then, which we'll explore a little bit deeper in and around using a digital form of money. And then accepted. Is it widely accepted by others? So when we went to salt, right, everyone saw a value in salt, using salt because you could cure meats. It was a commodity. It was easy to test. You could taste it and go, oh, yeah, that's salt. It's not powder or talc or some other form. So it was a widely accepted use because we had utility with it. So people saw a value in it. And that's probably, if I said to you, seashells are a great form of money, and you were like, no, they're not. That's not accepted, right? So I can have a view that it's a great form of money, but if you don't think the same thing, then that's a trade-off that you're making. And then finally, unit of account. And if this is going a little bit over your head, we're going to go through history and revisit some of these properties. But unit of account's the last one, and there's two main properties in unit of account. Is it divisible? So can I break it up into smaller denominations? So this is where, again, like gold in today's society is not a great form of money because it's not divisible. You go and try and buy a loaf of bread. Like, I don't know if you've ever bought a gold nugget, Benny, but 1 ounce gold nugget, right? It's about the size of maybe a 5-cent piece, a little bit thicker, quite weighty, but you can't arguably buy a loaf of bread in gold. You're going to have to come up with some other form of, coinage or an alloy or something like that, which we've done through history. And then fungible. Is any unit interchangeable with any other unit? So if I give you a $10 note, by its face value and everything, you trust that $10 is worth $10, right? Whereas if I give you salt, is it a good grading? If it's a seashell, what type of seashell is it? Like, where throughout history have we made these trade-offs in fungibility? And it's been down to like different societies. So that's a bit of a framework, and we're going to go right back now to the history of money. So ties back into some of the themes that we're talking about time and time again on this pod, is that money is a communication medium of how we communicate value to each other. Now, it started right back in the caveman days. Like, if we're a little tribe, a small tribe with, everyone knows one another, the earliest examples of some type of what we now understand, like looking back, like money is basically a ledger system. It's a check and balance of value, right? We use a placeholder, like something physical, but other times it was a social contract. So if we go back to the caveman days, there's actually another really good book called Sapiens by Yuval Navari, which goes through and explores the evolution of humanity. And he talks a lot about, money being one of these forms of value that we communicated. And back before we had money, before we evolved to a point where we'd accept something as a transactional medium in between, we would mark it up on the cave wall. So if Benny's out there, he's a boss, he's the mad fucking huntsman. He's got 4 mammoth kills. We've got a picture on the wall there. It wasn't like a picture to document history. It was basically, we're tallying up Benny's kills. He's got 4 kills, whereas old Dazza, he's a bit useless. He hasn't made any, right? So that social tallying your value and your contribution to the tribe. So from the early days, right, if you didn't pull your weight, you are either beaten, outcast, or eaten, essentially, right? If you weren't pulling your weight. So we've got that history. So it was the money's first iteration was a ledger system in and around that social contract and who's contributing to the tribe or who's leeching from the tribe. And, like I said, if you weren't pulling your weight, you were ousted. So that's a really easy framework to understand. But then we fast forward and we evolve and we start building villages, right? So now all of a sudden that village becomes bigger, and it leads into like sort of the industrial revolution and everything, where we're starting to specialize in trades. And that was a form of, the village grew so big that not everybody knew everyone. And we had different needs then. So, we started warring with neighboring tribes and stuff. So we started to have specialized skills. People started making weapons. There were foragers. There were people looking after the children in the village. There were farmers. And we started to develop specialized skills. And that naturally led then to a barter system. So bartering is very easy to understand. We still barter today. It's like, hey, why don't you swap me for my jet ski? You see that sort of stuff on Facebook all the time, marketplace. So bartering is still an essential human trait, but there was a challenge with bartering. So bartering started to facilitate some of these properties, like the medium of exchange then become to get a little bit more sophisticated in terms of, well, I'm a specialist. I'm going to, farm chickens. But, you're a warrior or a hunter and you need arrows. So, how are you going to feed yourself? The problem with barter, it facilitated then a challenge called the coincidence of wants. It's like, what happens if I'm a chicken farmer, but I don't need arrows? But you're a arrow maker, but you need chickens. It then starts to get really hard to facilitate that trade as a medium of exchange. So it naturally led to then the development of commodity monies. So commodities as a money, we've used the example a few times now in and around salt. That was probably the first iteration of a medium of exchange that was acceptable to others and recognizable. But then we started to introduce some other trade-offs in some of these other properties. So I've already mentioned durability. So if I wanted to do a big trade, so I was a cattle farmer or something, right? And you wanted some beef, you can take the whole cattle. But that meant that I've got a lot of salt because obviously, a cow is quite a big item in exchange for, whatever I want to facilitate into the future. So then comes a problem about how do I store that salt? So I've got to make it dry, right? So salt wasn't a great commodity money because it wasn't durable and it wasn't that portable. Big sacks of salt as well, had to keep them weatherproof, didn't travel all that well. So this was probably the first iteration of a commodity money that we started to use that had significant trade-offs, and then there's, depending on where you look in history as well, we've used different commodity money. So I brought up the fact of seashells. That sounds like a crazy idea, using seashells as a form of money, but they were relatively scarce in some locations. There's actually this really good book here called The Bitcoin Standard. Now, don't be confused about the title. This is actually not a book about Bitcoin. It's more a book about money and the history of money. And it talks about some of these examples of seashells. There was some island nations that used these massive big rye stones as a form of money. That's how you stake. Like the ownership of that was, that's, Benny's big rye stone up there. That's how much wealth he has. It was a display of wealth as well. But it wasn't a good money because it couldn't be transported.
Now, when we're talking about salt as a currency, what era are we talking about? When was salt used as a currency?
Look, Benny, there's it's I couldn't even put a date on it off the top of my head, mate. I'd have to look it up. But there's been, and depending on it's more around turn of, it's around that industrial revolution sort of stage as well. I couldn't put a number on it straight off the top of my head, mate.
The great spice trade. Spice was used.
Yeah, there's been spices were used. It depends on the area of the world as well. So, this is more of probably a generalist conversation in and around. There's been tea has been used. There's been glass beads that have been used. There's been seashells that have been used. There's been big stones. There's been spices. So I guess the underpinning outcome and the learning out of this was that through evolution, and we're talking early centuries, right? Like BC days. This is the sort of natural evolution from cavemen into villages into building out of specialist skills. It's early days, and it wasn't until like the early even BC days that we started to look at probably the best form of commodity money, which was monetary metals. So monetary metals come about. Actually, I'll take a quick step back before I get on to monetary metals. Some of these commodity type monies had massive trade-offs, right? One really quite diabolical example of this is the glass beads in Africa. As Europeans started to discover Africa, they discovered that these villages were trading in glass beads. Glass beads was a form of displaying wealth. Largely, you would wear them in big necklaces. You'd weave them into your garments, and glass beads were extremely scarce in Africa. So they actually worked really well as a form of money to communicate value to each other, because there was different colors, different sizes, all this sort of thing to facilitate that trade and express that store of value. However, as soon as Europeans come to Africa, they couldn't believe it. They arrived on the shores of Africa and they're going to these villages and they're looking at these people with glass beads and they're like, well, we'll just go back home and manufacture a shit ton of these glass beads. We'll import them over or export them from ours, import them into Africa. And some would argue, some historians would argue, that ignited the slave trade. Basically destroying an economy in one hit, one foul swoop, by introducing and flooding the market with excess units. So the Europeans come in and just flooded it with a money that was very easy for them to print, but it was relatively scarce. So that whole time was basically, like I said, don't mean that to be triggering, and I'm sure there's many historians that would argue, but there is significant evidence to suggest that was one of the causes to ignite the slave trade, global slave trade, was basically destroying their currency overnight. So that's why things like glass beads and seashells as well. Seashells, again, relatively scarce in some areas, but in abundance in others. So they're not a good form of money either, because you can just inflate it. If you've got access to more seashells than the country that advocates for them, then you're going to dominate them. So that's where naturally we arrived on commodity money is a great form of money, but it depends on the commodity. So it naturally then led to gold being probably the most pristine form of money, physical money, that we've ever had, even to this day. Gold, and this is where today you get lots of little pocket communities of gold bugs who have understood this problem. Gold has been a great form of money for the last 6,000 years. It's been coveted, it's been coined, it's been, and there's a few reasons why. If we look back at the properties of money, it satisfies a lot of the various properties that make money good, right? Gold is scarce. It takes an amount of energy to extract it from the ground. It's durable. It's inert. It doesn't react with other metals. It doesn't corrode. It can wear down somewhat if it's physical. But again, that's one of the trade-offs of this type of money, but it's arguably better than most other things. It's immutable. It's that bearer instrument. I hand that nugget over to you, Benny, and it's gone. I've got no claim to it. There's no digital footprint of it. It's a claim and it's final. Medium of exchange. There's a few issues with this, right? But it was somewhat portable in small quantities. Like you could, carry a bag around of gold coins and that'd be okay. When we start to get towards modern society with large global trade and large settlement, there are some challenges with gold. And we'll speak a bit more about that in the future. And it's widely accepted. So gold was it's hard to, back in the day, it was hard to forge. Today, arguably, there are some trade-offs with that. So it's not as widely accepted today for a number of reasons, which I won't really focus on. But if we think back to the day, coinage was relatively easy to prove, or at least had some faith in that it was hard to forge. And if you handed me over a gold piece that was stamped and had a value stamped on it, then there was a large degree of trust and acceptability of that, which made it a good form of money. And then unit of account. So it was divisible. So we could then, we started to introduce new monetary metals as well. So it wasn't just gold. Silver played a role as well for smaller denominations. We've had copper, we've had zinc, we've had alloys, all with various trade-offs as well. but largely monetary metals were divisible. Okay, we could have smaller denominations, we could have larger denominations, and it started to then facilitate that unit of account where I'm putting a dollar figure to the value of things, and then fungible as well. So if I had a coin that was stamped with a face value of $1, it was arguably accepted that $1 was $1. So that $1 coin spent exactly like the next $1 coin, which is all about fungibility of monies.
But now, with the gold, just before you go on, with the gold, that also brings in, though, like it's easier to steal. Like it's actually physically easier, and you would see it from history, like the great gold heists and robbing the trains and robbing all the, people getting their gold stolen. Even back into, you see in movies when they're in like the old days in the horse and cart and they're cruising around with their box of gold and they get pulled up and their gold taken off them. So it's probably harder to steal salt, probably harder to steal seashells, probably harder to steal a lot of that other trade that they had at the start, spices, all that sort of stuff. You got a big ship full of spice, it's going to be hard to steal. If you sink it, it's gone. But if you sink the gold's still there. He's going to swim down and get it. But that brings in that side of it as well.
Benny, I could not have asked for a better segue to the next evolution of money, to be perfectly honest. It's like I teed you up for that, and I swear to God we didn't. But you're 100% right. So because it's so final and it's a bearer instrument, you're right. Like if you stole it off me, it's gone. I've got no claim to it. I can't reverse. I can't call up Suncorp and go, "Oi, there was a scammer. Reverse that transaction." It was gone, right? So it wasn't. If I was to store all my wealth at home, that's a risk, right? Which actually led then to pretty much the first iterations of banks. Okay, to solve that problem in and around, hey, I need a bit more security. So if I'm just a farmer, right, I obviously don't have the wealth to go and hire a security detail to guard my gold. I might not even be able to afford to put a safe at home or come up with some sort of system to make that more secure. So this was really where the proliferation of banks come about. And the first banks were just warehouses, like commodities warehouses, right? So they were these centralized entities that would facilitate trade, right? So the salt trade, the spice trade, all of that would, again, you're not going to take receipt of necessarily all these spices if you're going to facilitate trade around the world. Like as the sea started to open up, all this sort of stuff and the spice trade come about, these warehouses would host and hold a lot of these commodities as an intermediary in that exchange, right? And naturally then they had, because they were banks and they took a percentage of all of the trade, then they become quite wealthy, and then they could start to facilitate some more of that security, hiring security personnel, safes, vaults, So then this was the spark of paper money, right? So if I'm a trader, I've got gold, I'm going to go and store it down in this bank. Now, how does the bank know that gold's mine? They issue me a paper receipt. And that paper receipt was a claim and it was redeemable for gold. And it said 1 gold bar. Didn't say my name or anything like that. It just said 1 gold bar, redeemable for 1 gold bar. Then, as commerce and localized trade started to, proliferate a little bit more, I might then go and trade with you directly, Benny. You might sell me a horse, right? That might be worth 1 gold bar. Now, what are we going to do? I agree to buy that horse off you. You agree to sell it to me. We agree on the price. Now we go down to the warehouse and I go, 1 gold bar, please, out of my stockpile. Here's a receipt. You give me the gold bar. I hand it to you, only for you to turn around and go and hand it straight back to them, right? So it stood to reason that the ease of trade then become, well, that little bearer instrument, that claim to gold is just as good as going to get the gold. So I'll just give you the paper receipt. So that's where paper money come from. Its very origins was paper money. Boom. Now, bankers being bankers, the temptation is a little too real. And this might have gone on for years. Like there's a good book that explores this a little bit more called The History of Money. No, it's The Mystery of Banking by Murray Rothbard, an Austrian economist. Looks at this actually really, really, really well. Gives a good example. Temptations of men, mate. And this has been probably one of the massive big trade-offs for everything through history, right? The temptations of men always start to corrupt, okay? With paper money. What these bankers or these warehouses started to realize was that, hang on, only like 10% of people come back for the physical gold. They're happy swapping these paper receipts. What if I just issued one more receipt? Right? Sounds a bit deceitful, and I'll guarantee this is exactly what happened. Sounds a little bit devious and deceitful, but they did this. They issued more paper receipts than had physical gold, and they didn't get caught out for quite a while. Eventually, chickens come home to roost, and society catches on to the fact that, hang on a second, who's auditing this? Who's going to making sure that there's enough paper receipts, there's enough gold backing each paper receipt that's issued? But by the time that they sort of caught onto this, what ended up happening was, this is where we introduce a concept called velocity of money, right? Credit spends exactly the same as physical dollars, right? If I'm giving you this paper receipt and you don't know there's a gold backing to it, it still spends the same way as the actual physical gold, right? Now, arguably, this started to ignite a lot of uplift in in society in general, but particularly economics. So my income or my spending is your income, right? Velocity of money, the changing hands of velocity. So what they actually noticed was that this extra increase in paper receipts actually spurred on really great economic outcomes. It actually spurred on more trade because, again, my spending is your income. So it didn't matter really that the gold was there. It's diabolical when you think about it. Like, they've basically invented credit out of thin air, and somebody's making that wealth, right? And arguably it's the bankers. And this has been the story from day old. It's like the banks. But it's true. They created credit out of thin air, and they got the benefit of that trade and from fees and all of this sort of stuff. And basically ended up like owning a lot of the wealth through a credit-based system that didn't have a monetary base. Now, the whims of men, so they got away with it, basically. The regulators and the authorities, politicians and of the day back then saw the economic stimulus of this credit-based system in their local economy. So they said, well, it can't be all that bad as long as we regulate and we keep a tether to it. And there was then the introduction of what we now know as fractionalized reserve banking. So you can have a fraction of reserves and have a credit-based system on top, but as long as you maintain the peg, as long as you maintain the reserves. So, and again, you can argue as we move forward through history, you can argue for and against the distortion of the peg for various reasons. So wars are typically where we've aborted or at least somewhat distorted the peg. So let's call it, and history is a bit vague here. Like when it first introduced, it was probably something in the order of like 90% reserves. You know, you have to have 90%, but you can lend 10. But then it become 80, then 70, then 50. Up to like today, loosely, it's 0, right? But even in the last couple of decades, it's been 10%, is arguably where most economists and central banks kind of argue you should have 10% reserves. But we've had time and time again where we've abandoned that altogether. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself. So fractional reserves is a thing, right? As a general acceptance that we can have a percentage of reserves and we can build a credit system that will spend into the economy. And there's a lot of economic benefit for doing it. However, what we're starting to do is remove ourselves from the peg, remove ourselves from the soundness of money. We're starting now to introduce some of the trade-offs in those properties that we started to see. So if you don't have a peg, it's no longer scarce. So if it's no longer scarce, then straight away we're starting to distort the store of value. And that's the number one thing that we keep coming back to as humans is money is our store of value. It's how we communicate value to each other. So if there's some governing body, and I don't care who it is, if it's a government, it's a central bank, it's some centralized entity that can now start to play with the peg, it's naturally going to start distorting how we show up.
There's nothing like from when I've started earning money and getting paid, there's never been a transaction where I've started with this. Everything I've got has just been a digital transfer of money that already existed. You know what I mean? Like everything I've done, my mortgage, every dollar I've earned, except for when I was 16 or 17 when I was getting paid cash in an envelope. But then everything from then onward has all just been a digital transfer of funds into my account for my services. So it's a very strange situation. Like back when you put your gold, you couldn't store your gold on your farm or wherever you lived back then. So you put it in the bank. They give you a paper receipt. That's your transaction of your earnings. But there's none of that anymore. It's all digital. Like everything's So where's all the money? Where is it? There's no physical.
Yeah, this is actually another really interesting. This is the next evolution, right? So we had paper money. At least you still had something physical, and it had some fractional reserve to it, and a societal trust mechanism, I guess, that paper receipt was redeemable for gold, and it used to say that on the US dollar bill, right? Redeemable for this amount in weight in gold, and that was the introduction of paper money. But then, as we start to fast forward, and I don't want to get too ahead into digital just yet, because I agree with you, Benny. That's even more of an abstraction of value. Is now that we don't even have the paper, we've got a digital representation of the paper, and we don't even have the peg to gold. So the reserves are paper, but the paper reserves aren't backed by anything anyway. So it's a total abstraction from actual value, right? And again, why it's so easy now. We had a look at a graph last episode of the M2 money supply for the US, and the Aussie one looks pretty much exactly the same. It's just too easy now for them to. They don't even. We still call it printing money, but they don't even print it. They just add a zero to a balance sheet on a centralized ledger, and this comes back to ledgers as well. In and around commerce, so we started with this. I'll jump back ahead. I'll jump back to where we were. Paper money, fractional reserves, gold backing. Then we fast forward through. We've abandoned gold standard, so we call that the gold standard, a gold backing to a paper-based currency. And there's been history, time and time again through history, where they've abandoned that for various reasons. So the Civil War was a great example of that. So they largely won the war by printing money out of thin air, abandoning the peg altogether, issuing greenbacks, what they call greenbacks. That's where the term greenbacks comes from, and basically paid for an army with paper gold based on this temporary structure that greenback spent just exactly the paper receipt spent exactly like the physical, right? So, and it was actually a very clever move. Abandon the gold peg, flood with greenbacks, and win the war. That didn't work for Rome. That's arguably one of the catalysts for the fall of Rome was coinage. They had coinage. They had the denarius, which was a silver-based currency. And there's time and time again through history of what they call coin clippage, right? And it's actually where, like a 20-cent coin, we got the little ridges around the outside of it, just shaven. They called it coin clipping. They just clip a little nugget out of the side of it, right? Melt it, recast it, spin up. As long as it had the stampage of the $1 or the 20 cents or whatever the case may be, it's still spent like it would, right? No comment. And yeah, and then they also started playing with the alloy, right? So weight based on silver coin, they started mixing in other alloys and then diluting the actual silver content. And then basically the whole Roman army become mercenaries because they were like, we don't trust your dollar anymore. You're flooding the market. You're paying for us in this diluted fact. And basically that was one of the first real historical facts of like inflation, right? From a coinage perspective, was the fact that they flooded the market then with what they knew had the same face value but didn't have the underlying. And it introduced hyperinflation, completely eroded the trust in it, and completely decimated the Roman Empire just by fucking with the money. And time again through history, they fuck with the money. This is where problems start. Every major war can be argued in and around. It was a fight for commodities, fight for money, fight for energy. These are the types of themes that keep popping up time and time again. Was fight for scarce assets, and inflation normally is the cause of mass revolt and collapse of societies, collapse of civilizations. So time and time again. So the greenback, that worked for them that time, right? But that sets a little bit of a precedent. And they went back to the gold peg after that. After they won the war, they're like, oh, we'll peg back to gold at some point, right? Don't ask me the exact particulars of the ratio, but they did. Then you fast forward to World War One, right? Not going to get into the mechanics of why that started, but it was a very expensive war, right? After World War One, there's a really good book called When Money Dies, and it's all about the hyperinflationary event of Weimar Germany. So the Treaty of Versailles, France basically made Germany pay a shit ton of money as reparations from World War One, to the degree in which they were never ever going to pay. So again, they had a gold-backed currency. They abandoned that peg, and they started printing. And it led, that whole book is about, like, it's a really shocking, it's a bit dry, it's a bit hard to get through, but it's a really shocking example of hyperinflation in a kind of modernized society. It was also like the Depression, obviously global depression, also impacted around that same timing, but they basically printed money out of thin air, and people, there's images of people walking down the street with their pay with a wheelbarrow full of currency, and the only thing they're doing with that is lighting the fire when they get home. That's the only thing it was useful for. So what that led to was, as soon as you got your money, you would go out and you would rush and you would buy anything that wasn't pegged down. The line up at the bakery was, blocks long, because that was a form of storing value. Storing it in my bread that can go stale within 2 days was a better form. It held the current. They were printing it that much that you had to spend it, because by the same afternoon, it had already inflated by hundreds into thousands of %. That's what hyperinflation looks like. And it was also argued then that that whole period of time post World War One was really what ignited Hitler, right? They don't want to. This is a loaded thing, so I don't really want to get too deep into it. But arguably, history can show that Hitler then introduced like a thing called labor bonds and really picked Germany up out of the scrap heap, where people were driving out to farms and ripping legs off live pigs. That's how bad it was getting, because they just couldn't eat. They couldn't. The money was completely destroyed. Hitler gave them hope, and this is how, and again, I'm not going to get into it, but it really sparked the rise of Hitler, right? And sparked then World War II. And this is very important in the evolution of money as well as World War II. So US were very late into World War II. They stood back and they were arming everybody. They were building the tanks, building the planes, building the ammunitions, sitting back, exporting food. They became the global industrial hub for export, for everything, while all these other countries were fighting massive wars that were super expensive. What ended up happening from there was, like, the US obviously wouldn't accept the French franc, any of the currencies from any of the countries. What did they want? They wanted gold, right? So what happened after World War II? All the gold ended up flowing into the US. Well, eventually the US get, Pearl Harbor happens, US get involved, drop a few bombs and go, yay, we won, right? But what happened after World War II was that everyone's looking around to repair, right? They've all abandoned their gold pegs. They've all printed currency out of thin air, and all the gold ended up in the US because they sat back just accepting everyone's gold while they armed everybody. And we ended up with there was something in the order of 75% of the world's gold ended up in the US. And then they're like, shit, what do we do? How do we repair our pegs? How do we repair our currencies? And they all met in, can't remember the year, but it's called the Bretton Woods system. You can look it up. And all the world economists and all these world leaders got together and said, how are we going to fix this? So we come up with the Bretton Woods system. And this was arguably then the catalyst or the spark for the US dollar being the global reserve currency. So they said, we will peg our US dollar to gold and you will peg your currencies to ours. And we had this fixed exchange service where the US dollar was then redeemable for gold, but everyone else had their own individual currencies and they were all pegged at fixed exchange rates. But this is where the problem. So we fast forward then to around the 70s or late 60s, 70s, and the US started to expand that peg somewhat again. Again, if there's no sort of regulation and the whims of men, temptations are too great, the Vietnam War was really expensive, right? So they started to expand the peg and expand the redeemability of the dollar. The other thing that they started to notice was we spoke again about like fractional reserves and credit systems. So there was like a euro dollar market as well. So euro, because the US is starting to be the global reserve currency, there's a demand for dollars, US dollars globally. Now, if you've got some sort of fractional reserve bank, and I'm France, right, and I own this bank, and I've got some US dollar reserves, I've got a credit system too, right? And we've already spoken, credit spends exactly like dollars. So what happens is the euro dollar market started expanding credit, and then they started going back to the US to demand the gold. And then come 1971, Richard Nixon was president, and this is known as the Nixon shock. 1971, he closed the gold window. he started to notice that these banks were coming back, extracting the gold out because of credit. Again, credit spends like dollars. So they were using the credit to extract the gold back out of Fort Knox, right? And he said, fuck you, our dollar, your problem. And he closed the redeemability for gold in 1971. That's the Nixon shock. And that, my friend, is the fucking catalyst for where we are today. 1971 was the start. He didn't. He didn't. It was then it was come at us. Like, we are the global superpower, the global super. So the France caught onto this early, right? They actually sent a US Navy fleet to the US, not as a threat, not as to like, we're going to blow you up, but we want our gold. We're sending a US fleet. We want all our gold back. Here's all your dollar. Here's all your paper claims, all our reserves. We're going to give it back to you, but we want our gold. We're going home. And then he said no. And all the other countries started to catch onto it as well. And he's like, our dollar, your problem. Come at me, bitch. Basically is where we're at. So 1971 through to today was the start of fiat currency. So we've gone through this history, Benny, of all of these trade-offs, right? But 1971 was the start of the end for our problems today, when we completely left any sort of gold backing to sound money, what we call sound money. Sound money being money that satisfies a lot of the properties that make a good money, right? Gold was it, store of value. So 1971, we're on fiat currency, but then it starts to get a little bit worse. Now, a few things to support why that come about. That was one of the major things, right? Was this redeemability for gold issue, Nixon closing the gold window, but also what reinforces the use of paper money was the problem with gold. So if we go back to gold, we argue that gold is arguably the best form of money we've seen in 6,000 years. It had some massive trade-offs, particularly as we get into a digitized world, and global commerce. So if you were France settling a trade with Japan from export, as Japan started to get really good at electronics and all that sort of stuff, it was an electronic super hub, technology super hub. How are you going to settle a trade between those two countries if you're France and you owe Japan money? Japan doesn't want your francs, maybe to a degree. They might keep some reserves in their central bank, right? But arguably they want gold, right? So how are you going to facilitate that trade? You've got to weigh it, store it, secure it, ship it all the way over the other side of the world. Then when you're Japan, do you trust France? No, probably not. So you want to probably melt it down, recast it, remint it, make sure it's actual gold and it's not an alloy and it's not, and all of that is way too expensive, way too slow, and just too cumbersome to facilitate global trade. So that kind of reinforced the acceptance of a paper-based currency, and also reinforced the US dollar as being a reserve medium in that, because then we can facilitate a trade a little bit better. Paper money is arguably a lot easier to ship around the world. So it kind of reinforced the acceptability of this at the trade-off of, the potential for store of value. But in the moment, you didn't understand that the trade-off you were making was this scarcity, right? So it become the US dollar became the global reserve currency because it was just easier to facilitate the trade. And then the US developed what they call the SWIFT system. As we started to get into telemetry and communications via telegraph, the SWIFT network was then the equivalent of the digital transfer through, and then the US were this superpower in the middle, facilitating all this trade for using the SWIFT network, which was basically settlement, right? But going back to the caveman days of a ledger system, where we have checks and balances in and around who owes what, right? Who owns what. The other reason gold failed was in that regard as well. So there was a few different facilities, but one was the Bank of International Settlements. There's a really good book called The Tower of Babel, which looks at this. The Bank of International Settlements used to be an institution in Europe. I think it's Switzerland or Sweden. Babel. I can't remember what country that's in. Pardon me. The particulars are eluding me at the moment. But they had vaults and they had people's pile of gold. And this is where, in order for gold to work as a currency, there needs to be trusted intermediaries. And this trusted intermediary at the time was the Bank of International Settlements. They had vaults with little, you can imagine these big piles of gold, and this one's got Australia's name on it. This one's got Germany's name on it, France, And in World War II, the Germans invade Czechoslovakia, Once they do that, they contact the Bank of International Settlements and say, hey, you know that big pile of gold with Czechoslovakia's name on it? That's now ours. And the Bank of International Settlements goes, okay. That was it. So it highlights the challenge with facilitating trading gold with an trusted intermediary. And it's where we're starting to get away from. Like, I don't want to jump ahead too early into solution mode, but this is where we're trying to solve these things. Us as humans need these things to be solved because it's distorting the way we show up. It's distorting, if we don't have a good currency or a good money, it's coming back to episode 1, episode 2. It's starting to distort where it's going wrong. And from paper money, 1971, Nixon shock, we start to get more digitized. The internet, fast forward to the 90s, the internet starts to pop up and it becomes more and more important to facilitate trade really quick, right? So if we've got a paper-based currency and we've got a credit system backed on that paper-based currency, they're still arguably working off some sort of fractional reserve. They want a percentage of the physical dollars in circulation to back the credit in the system. But then as we start to digitize that, it becomes really, really easy to abstract from the fractional reserve. And you can argue, I'll challenge anybody to go and tell me what the fractional reserve ratio is for reserves to credit now in any developed country. And you might come back with a few opaque things, but like the last reference you can really find from the US last time I looked, I'll probably get corrected here, but they banned it in 2020 altogether. Remember that graph I showed you last week, Benny, with the M2 money supply, where we get to 2020, COVID, and it just goes parabolic? They abandoned any notion of a fractional reserve from physical dollars backed by nothing to credit dollars backed by nothing. And just the fact that we now run digital ledgers makes it very, very easy to have a completely opaque system with who knows what is the base money supposed to be. It's really, really hard to track, and it's very, very easy to expand.
Back to the where Nixon shut it down. So he's got everyone's gold, right? That they had left over from World War II. Took all that, exchanged it, made the US dollar the global currency. That was just everyone agreed on that. But then when he shut down the gold, where did the gold go? Where is it? Where is all that gold now?
Very good question. Nobody knows. It's supposed to be in Fort Knox, but Fort Knox hasn't been audited since. Like Elon Musk was only recently in the last few years when he got. Did you? I don't know how much you follow US politics, but Elon Musk got stood up as what they call it, Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, and they were calling for Fort Knox to be audited, and it hasn't been audited, so they don't know. They think there's far less than the US actually says. And this is also where, if you look at behaviors of countries over the last couple of years, China's probably the best example of this. So they used to have a lot of US reserves, right? So if you look at global trade, and this comes into bonds and all that, which is actually, it's going to be a nice segue for next week's discussion where we look at what are your options for investing, right? So bonds play a massive role. I won't get too bogged down in bonds. I'll explain bonds next week, what bonds really are. But bonds are basically like government credit, right? Government wants to borrow, they issue a bond. Someone says, I'll give you 10 grand, Mr. Government. You'll give me an interest rate. You'll pay me the 10 grand back in a couple of years' time. Because of the US dollar's dominance in global trade, there's a lot of demand for US dollars, which arguably then introduces their ability to be able to print more money or issue more bonds, right? Same sort of thing with a few caveats, a few different discrepancies. But the more demand for my dollar, the more I can issue. Now, as an example, today, Daz are going to print some money, right? I'm going to issue it to the market. Who's going to buy my bond? No one, because there's no trust, there's no demand. Whereas the US dollar facilitates a lot of trade, therefore they are incentivized also to make sure there is demand for the dollar. And this comes into another argument, maybe for another episode, for another day, but it sparked the rise of the Bank of International Settlements. There's a lot of global initiatives like the IMF, forget what that acronym stands for now, but they go out and they create debt in these developing markets to create demand for dollars, basically. Dollar-denominated debt, make sure there's demand for US dollars, which actually then means the more demand you've got, the more you can print and get away with it. It also, because we left the gold standard, the US realized that they did need some sort of peg to gold. Now, it's not facilitated necessarily in reserves, but one way you can make sure that you maintain demand for dollar is to make sure that oil is transacted in dollars. So what did they do? They go to Saudi Arabia. They say, you've got a shitload of oil reserves here, but you know what? You don't have an army. You guarantee you denominate oil trade in US dollars and we will give you that army. And that's now known as the petrodollar system. So that gave them a sort of pseudo peg to make sure there's consistent demand for the dollar without having to peg it to gold, and it's not redeemable for oil, right? It's a different kind of peg, but it was a way to make sure that there was consistent global demand because everyone needs oil. It's the base layer of human flourishing is energy, right? One of the base layers. Keep coming back to that. We'll keep coming back to energy and money, right? They're the two things that sort of all wars are fought over. But that was one way that they then introduced this demand, consistent demand for the dollar, and also can be argued then, which was the catalyst for most of the major conflicts over the last few decades. War in Iraq was weapons of mass destruction, which we now know been declassified documents to support the fact that that was bullshit. But Saddam Hussein started selling oil in euro and in gold. Big no-no. You don't fucking do that. Same with Gaddafi. Started selling oil in gold. You don't fucking do that, right? I probably won't wake up tomorrow. If I'm not back for episode 4, people have said too much. This is no secret, right? This is no secret. But now we're starting to understand it, right? Yeah. So we've got demand for the dollar. They issue more bonds, which makes them basically print an army out of thin air too. When you have that much demand for your currency, you can basically issue as much credit as you want because there's also demand from other countries. So again, I introduced China. This is exactly what happened with China. China, mid-2010s, like that decade, started to realize, hang on a second, this is rubbish. They just keep printing this paper out of thin air. We keep buying it back. Like we keep exporting goods and services and we accept US dollars in exchange. What do they do with that US dollar? They buy bonds so that they get an interest rate back on it. So they've got all of this US dollar treasury, which the US controls. And then you can fast forward to the Russia and Ukraine conflict, right? That was a big flag for US dollar reserves in your central bank aren't a good thing to have because of the fact that they control the SWIFT network and they can sanction you as a country. So they basically seized all of Russia's US reserves. They said, you want to fuck around with Ukraine? Your dollars are worth nothing. So they basically seized the US dollars, which also then flagged to other countries to go, maybe the US isn't such a great reserve currency because they've got so much control over global commerce. So if you look at the behaviors of other central banks around the world, the overwhelming theme, they have been buying hand over fist. And the best example of this is China, is gold. They have been hoarding gold hand over fist. So if there's anything that comes out of this conversation is when in doubt, do what central banks do. You don't want to hold dollars. You want to hold something that's worth satisfying some of these other commodities. Now, do I think gold's a good investment? I actually do. Up to recently owned quite a bit of physical gold, both in self-managed super funds and all of that. But however, it comes with some caveats and some trade-offs we won't get into today. We'll save that for the next episode. But arguably, the goal is to get back to sound money. Like this is where you look around the world, central banks are doing this hand over fist. They're like, we don't want this paper shit anymore. It's overinflated. There's too much credit. It's losing purchasing power hand over fist. Inflation now is higher than the interest rates that we get back from holding these bonds, the coupons that we get. It's the same situation for you personally is happening at a global level. But central banks are realizing that they cannot hold cash reserves. They need to get back to some sort of sound base money to satisfy all these things.
But on the gold, I went into the Perth Mint probably 2-3 months ago just to have a look and see what the actual physical ounce of gold looked like, and it is tiny. It is tiny. It is like as big as my thumb, not even. And that was $7,400 and something an ounce, right? And I'm like, holy shit! I was going to go buy one, but I'm like, I'm not buying that. Like it's tiny.
You're not going to get wealthy with gold. Gold is a phenomenal store of value. It is a store of value, but you will not build wealth. It doesn't earn you a yield. This is what, like Warren Buffett's arguably the most successful investor of all time in history. He's a value investor. We'll talk about what that means next week. But he hates gold because it doesn't produce an income for him. So as a really good example, if you wanted to go and get, and this is probably large, if you go back about 12 months, like gold's had a massive run. So it wasn't $7,000 even 12 months ago, right? It was about the start, it was about 12 months ago. But
No, but on that, before you get into that, when I went, you look at the gold price online, like the day before I looked online, it was 5,500 in Australia, whatever it was. But then I went into Perth Mint, and to buy an actual ounce of gold was 7,400. Like, it's not the price that you see online. It's what, you know what I mean? So I don't know how that works. Like, you see online.
we might come back to that. We might come back to that next week. That's basically how these guys make money. They call it spread between the spot price, and what you actually buy and sell for. There's a spread there that they scalp and make money. But just, well, as an example, so Warren Buffett calls gold a pet rock. He goes, it's great. It's, as a pet rock. It doesn't produce you a yield. It's a great store of value. It won't make you wealthy, but it will help preserve your wealth. If that's your goal, great. And if you take the last sort of 12 months out of it, what's happened in the last 12 months is people are just starting to realize. People are starting to wake up to the fact that, shit, everything else is got problems. It's got a monetary premium. Let's get back to the sound money. So now gold's actually attracted, pure monetary premium now as well. But if you look at the gold performance, so you go back maybe 18 months is probably a better, and you go back through the last 100, it's got peaks and troughs, right? But the average trend line, the average performance of gold, if you wanted a nice tailored suit in the year 1900, it would cost you 1 gold ounce. If you want a nice tailored suit 18 months ago, it would cost you 1 gold ounce. That's the correlation. That's the example of it being a great store of value, but it won't. Arguably, yes, if you can time the trade, and you could have bought, in 2020 and sold at the top last year, great. That's a great trade, and you probably outperform the store of value. So it has peaks and troughs, but it will. Can it play?
If you wanted to go and buy a loaf of bread with gold, right, you'd have to give them the tiniest little slice off that. That's what I mean with the trade. You talked about it earlier. Like, you can't just go and use gold as trade to buy your everyday shit, because it'd be minute little tiny bit of shit. You know what I mean?
Exactly right, Betty. So now we're starting to look at then the properties of money again, and now the trade-off with gold is divisibility. So it's got it's attracted such a premium of value in a small bundle now that it actually is now starting to suffer those other trade-offs like divisibility. I can't go and buy a loaf of bread with gold because, one, how much am I going to shave off? And then two, how are you going to prove it when I've shaved it off? So then the argument then is, well, coins can come back again. But again, it's like the trust mechanism between what is the actual, like our coins now, they don't have any gold in them. There's just some sort of alloy with a faceplate. There's no, once upon a time, 100%. This is the whole British pound, sterling, silver, was all about the actual weight of the gold. That's the whole reason. It was a pound, of silver. Was a pound of sterling silver was a pound's worth of value. So now, like exactly. Now it's some sort of nickel alloy, which is basically not worth, dollar.
There is literally zero. We Googled this not long ago. There's literally zero gold in our gold coins. There's no gold at all.
So it stands to reason that it could, if you could do it right and you could do it with trust and all that, it could then facilitate a decent form of money again, right? But this is where, again, just coming back to this point to hammer it home, is now physical metals do not keep up with global trade. Because of those transport issues, the verifiability issues, all of that sort of thing, it doesn't keep up with. And that's where now our digital dollars, the digital version of our fiat currency facilitates that, right? And now we've come right back to the caveman days of like money just being a ledger, right? A ledger system of like Westpac Bank, right, might have my bank account details, and it's got a ledger that says Daz owns this much currency in this account, Betty owns this much currency in this account, but there's no centralized ledger. Everyone's running their own form of ledger, and there's a massive big trust, and there's obviously regulations and all of this sort of stuff to try and keep control of that. But it's basically just a whole form of individual ledgers with some sort of regulations and a lot of trust and a lot of inherent, a lot of inherent trust in that whole mechanism. Digital numbers. Yeah. And again, the whims of men have proven time and time again that in times of, and you can argue that, okay, put in the same position, would I have printed money in 2020 to try and keep society going? Probably I would have, because if I didn't, what would the outcome have looked like? Everyone lost their jobs. Everyone's working from home. Everyone's, society just stopped. So if they didn't print money, we could have ended up in a far, far worse situation. However, it's important just to realize that it's the fish analogy again. Now we're starting to realize, holy shit, what we're swimming in is water. What we're operating in, and this is the whole point of these last 3 episodes, is to really paint the picture for everybody to understand the problem. The problem is the money. All right. Next episode, we're going to start looking at some of the solutions. Now we've identified a problem, Daz. That's great. Now, what the fuck can we do about it? And this is where, again, everything comes with a trade-off. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. Money. Every form of money has a solution. It's introduced a trade-off. Same with investing. There's going to be options. Housing might be for you. It's going to be a trade-off. Bonds might be for you. There's going to be a trade-off. there's going to be a trade-off. There's so many things, but what is mostly important is people are informed. I'm going to show you just one quick slide, Benny, just to really hammer home what is the problem, right? There is a website. We'll put it in the show notes. It is called What the Fuck Happened in 1971. WTF happened in 1971. And I'm not going to bother going through, but what this website is just a series of charts and charts and charts and charts and charts with highlighting what happened in 1971. We left the gold standard. We left any sort of peg to any sort of form of sound money, and we've been operating on a fiat currency.
Now, on that, right, who was advising Nixon to do all this? Who were his advisors back then?
There'll be a lot of economists. John Maynard Keynes is arguably, Keynesian economics is largely what we operate in. I don't know what year he died, whether he was even still around then. But a lot of this is based on, Keynes was definitely part of the Bretton Woods system, where they're starting to talk about US dollar hegemony. And the Keynesian economics is what most economists will study going through any sort of finance degree. You'll study Keynesian economics. The alternative thought, which is a lot of what I prescribe to and a lot of what I've studied, is the Austrian economic model. And the Austrian economic model at its fundamental, at its foundation, and there's many, many people who know this a lot better than me, and perhaps we'll get some of those people on the show eventually, Benny, to talk about this as well. But Austrian economics is tied to praxeology being human action, how we show up as humans. So a lot of what the Austrian economists stand for is a lot in and around what capitalism was built on and the foundations of capitalism. Now, that's a loaded term too, and I don't want to get too political, and perhaps we'll do another episode on capital. We're not in capitalism. We're in crony capitalism. Capitalism is about rewarding your effort, right? And everyone understands that, right? And this is where, I guess, not having a great understanding of economics, socialism gets a lot of spark. It's let's tax the rich, and hand it out to all us plebs down at the bottom. And I get the notion for that. However, it's socialism completely disconnected from you as a human. This is particular for men, and again, that's not to be a sexist comment, but men need purpose. You know yourself, Benny. If you go to work, you're not getting fulfilled, you're not getting satisfied, it's not challenging. It's a road to depression. You're not getting fulfilled. You're not feeling purpose. You're not coming back home going, I did a great day. And more importantly, when your money doesn't work or you're not getting compensated appropriately for that, that's where it starts to distort you, particularly men. This is where men become really, really challenged in mental health problems, is when they don't have fulfillment.
But on that what you touched on before about it doesn't work giving out money. You can't just give everyone, the people who say that you should just give, why don't they just give everyone this much money and spread it all out? It doesn't work. You can't do that. Then the value of money's gone. Everything loses value. It's gone. Like Russell Brand talks a lot of good shit, and I've watched him years ago, watched some of the stuff he was talking about, and his view on that is just give everyone should just get a fair share of all this, and it's it doesn't work. You can't do that. You can't just give everyone money. Then you lose value of everything.
There's an interesting book by a lady named Dr. Stephanie Kelton, who was one of Bernie Sanders and I believe also the Biden administration's economic advisors. She's got a book called The Deficit Myth, and it is worth reading. I read it just to question my own belief system, but it is a farce. It is based on this notion of universal basic income where you can just, and she's right to a point, right? And it goes back to like some of the arguments you'll hear. Like if we can print money out of thin air, why do we pay tax? Very sound argument, right? But like it's not looking at the root problem. It's looking at various solutions and actually making the problem worse. So you can say, okay, if I don't have to pay tax, and also if I can print money out of thin air, why don't I just print money out of thin air and give everyone a universal basic income? It again erodes, it distorts the value proposition. Like if everyone starts with the same amount of units, we all go and compete for the same amount of goods.
But then everything goes up. Everything goes up in price as well. So it doesn't just distort the money. It doesn't just devalue the money. Everything goes up because everyone's got money for it. So everyone charges more for everything.
Yep, 100%, Benny. And they've been printing money. Like that graph we showed last week, that M2 money supply, that's where we start. And it's mostly due to economic instability, right? They're like, if we don't act, things will get ugly really, really quick. And we don't want to live through another depression, right, where people can't eat. So you can. Sometimes I'm guilty of framing them as they evil, blah, 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 blah. But if you give them a pass, they're just probably humans who don't have enough knowledge. Not to say that I do, right? But you have people in positions of power, and it's not hard to understand. Some of these mumpties we have in as politicians, you know for a fact they haven't read Austrian economics. You know what I mean? They're not fully informed, but they're doing the best that they can do with the knowledge they have and the tools that they have available. And the downstream effects are arguably then they're put off. It comes back to this high time preference versus low time preference. It's like, if I just print money now and inject it in the economy, we'll buy ourselves some time. But what's happening is the longer term effects are starting to now be understood, but weren't understood in the moment. So, you know, all we have to do is look at that, spend a bit of time having a look at those charts on what the fuck happened in 1971. And it's just, you can see how it's starting to distort how we show up in every aspect, from Kansas soup on there through to the, you know, GDP to human to wage, to real estate to human wage, to this divergence from 1971 onwards. There's just too much evidence to suggest that it's okay to keep doing what we're doing. And the other thing I think I touched on last week, Benny, when we were looking at M2 money supply chart, was in 2000 and 2008, they introduced these different mechanisms. Like 2008, they introduced what they called quantitative easing, which is just a fancy way of saying we print money. But what was interesting was that all that happened was it ended up in assets and not in everyday price inflation. So they got away with it. And it created a bit of a, you know, the decision makers, there's a feedback mechanism in that decision-making process when in and around, well, everyone's getting richer and our assets are going up. Great if you own assets already. Piss poor if you don't, which is what we're finding now with, you know, with millennials and Gen Zs struggling to get in the property market. But if you already own the property, then who are the decision makers? The decision makers are normally people closer to that money spigot. The injection point of that money is where you proliferate the most. So it looks great in the moment for you as a decision maker because everyone's affluent. Everyone's property prices are going up. So what's the harm? Let's just keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. The problem then is you get into 2020 where we've set this precedent of being able to print money out of thin air, and now asset prices were going up. So it's like, well, we'll just print a bit more, but we're on the precipice of something really fucked up. Global trade's going to shut down. Everyone's going to have to work from home. There's going to be massive job losses. We've got to print, and we got to print hard. And now that's where we're now seeing the repercussions of this. So the asset owners go huge, but now they're turning more, I guess you could argue, into more consumerism, right? So they're selling down some of these assets, realizing some of these gains and buying themselves lots of pretty things, right? Which is now starting to go back into, and it's always a function of more units competing for goods, right? Same with your example, universal basic income. If I give everybody, you know, the equivalent money every week, it's going to lead to price inflation. you can't do it, mate. That was a lot to chew on. So homework. We always give you the outcomes, right? So there's a few things. Not that you have to do this, right? But if you
these are they have to do it. Tell them what they have to do.
I'll load you up too many books. If you're interested in that subject, there's 2 books here. This one is a tome.
We'll put these on the links to this episode as well.
Yep. Broken Money by Lynn Alden talks a lot about the ledger, where we are, globalization, why gold failed. This book here is arguably a smaller version. This is called the Bitcoin Standard. This is not about Bitcoin. It's about the history of money. Talks a lot about what we spoke about.
Audio books as well. Can you listen to them?
I believe all of them are audiobooks. They are, yes, all available on Amazon, Audible, Kindle versions, physical copies. Very well worth. If you only read one book outside the Barefoot Investor, make it this one, the Bitcoin Standard. And then lastly, to shill my own, right, what we did is we've taken a lot of the outcomes of these types of books and created a course. I've spoken about it before. If you go to www.lookingglasseducation.com, up the top, you'll click on the Bitcoin course. Again, not about Bitcoin necessarily, but it talks about this problem. So what you want is module 1, reiterates a lot of these things. So this course here,
we'll link all that as well, mate. 100%.
Talks about those properties again, gives you a good outcome, gives you a good journey through that history of money to reiterate the problem. Okay, and that's where we're at. And next week we start getting into the meat. We've eaten the veggies. Next week we're going to start looking at then, well, if this is the problem, how do we fix it? Okay, so that's going to be episode 4.
That's awesome. So the takeaways from episode 1 and 2 was the Barefoot Investor. We doubled up. Episode 2, we want to go Barefoot Investor again. And then this one, we've got the 2 links for them 2 books will go on here, and also for the Looking Glass. Make sure you get on there and check that out. Dazza,
yep,
appreciate it.
If you only chose one, just do the course.
Always a pleasure, beautiful, my friend.
Man.
Cheers, bud.
Giddy up, dude.
Talk to you.
See you next week.
See you, mate.